Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is the daughter of one of the greatest comedic legends of all time, Don Knotts. He is best remembered for playing the hilarious and lovable Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show, for which he won 5 Emmy Awards. He also played Mr. Furley on the hit comedy series Three's Company. And who can ever forget him in his classic comedy films, including The Incredible Mr. Limpet, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, The Shakiest Gun in the West, and the Apple Dumpling Gang movies. Don Knotts was beloved by millions of fans throughout the world. He won 2 TV Land awards, including the TV Land Legend Award. TV Guide named him one of the greatest TV stars of all time. He's been inducted into the Online Film and TV Hall of Fame. And of course, he has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. His daughter has written a poignant and intimate book about her father entitled Tied Up in Knots, My Dad and Me. And she tours the country in a highly acclaimed one-woman show honoring her dad called Tied Up in Knots. I'm thrilled to welcome Karen Knotts to our show. Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's nice to be here. Thank you, Harvey. I've heard wonderful things about your show and your interviews.
Karen, I must tell you that I loved your book because you gave us an insightful portrait of not only Don Knotts, the comedy genius, but also Don Knotts, the complex human being. Now, he passed away in 2006 and you published the book in 2021. Why did you wait so long to write the book?
Well, everybody has always asked me to please write a book about my dad. And I would say, no, I'm not an author, I'm an actor, which was how I felt. And until now, I just had no interest in writing a book, and I didn't see what the point was, really. But at some point along the way, maybe about 10 years ago, I started thinking, well, maybe I'm missing an opportunity here to really let people know that my father was not Barney Fife, which is the feeling I get. Like, people think he was those characters because he played them so brilliantly. They thought that he was really like that. And that kind of always bothered me a little bit. So I started collecting interviews about 10 years ago from people, friends of my father, or I even went to Morgantown, West Virginia, and I put the word out on Facebook and on radio that I was looking for people who knew my father, who had stories about my father growing up. And a nice group of people showed up, maybe 25 people came, and I got some wonderful stories. And all of a sudden, I started getting motivated, really interested in writing the book. And then I went to his high school, his alma mater, which was Morgantown High School, he had always told me was his breakout period was in high school, where he really became, the popular boy, and he was loved and accepted, and his comedy started coming out, and he was just having a blast. So after those 2 experiences, I got all these interviews, but I still didn't start writing the book. I guess I was busy, with my one-woman show, and that really took up most of my time. So it wasn't until I decided to look for an actual publisher, and then I got one, and then all of a sudden I had to write the book.
You wrote that your dad was and will always be the greatest enigma of your life. Why?
Well, because he's so quiet. And there were so many wheels turning, in his head all the time. And there were questions I always wanted to ask him, but didn't until, maybe toward the end, I asked him, I said, how do you feel about people like treating you like such a star that you and friends? And he said, well, people go through that initial stage and then they get over it. And that was kind of a funny response. I wasn't expecting that. Because I don't think they ever really got over it with him. They were always in awe of him. But that's the way he felt.
Your dad had a painful childhood, and you said that he had a lot of deep-rooted insecurities. He was a perfectionist and a hypochondriac and a worrier. But on the other hand, he was very charismatic and popular. In high school, he was voted the most popular student, and he was class president for 3 out of 4 years. Isn't it amazing that despite all those insecurities, he was able to put himself out there so successfully as a comedy performer?
That is amazing. Yes, that's the true enigma, I think, too. Part of that enigma is how he overcame all of that with just his creativity, his just an innate funniness, but he also had a very loving family, even though they had problems. They had big problems, but they would laugh together every night at dinner. That was his favorite event of the day, was the dinner time when all of the boys, the three older brothers, would compete for their mother's laughter. And he was absorbing all of this and learning from these brothers. But they would all clown around and they would listen to the radio during the day, and they would imitate the radio stars at dinner, and it was just hilarity.
Your book provides so much information about the Andy Griffith Show, which is a beloved TV classic. For example, I had no idea that it was your dad who actually came up with the idea of creating the character of Deputy Barney Fife. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I know. He pitched it to Andy. He said, "Don't you think that Sheriff Taylor ought to have a deputy?" And so Andy said, set up a meeting with Sheldon Leonard and said, "Go on in there." And I think he was in the meeting too. And I don't know exactly what went on in that meeting, but I know he improvised quite a bit with the character. And then Sheldon originally only had in mind to have him on the show like one or two times, like as a guest actor. But he quickly realized this was an incredible performer and they had the incredible connection. And so he quickly signed him on to a long-term contract.
Another fascinating thing I learned from your book is that Don Knotts wasn't just a great actor on the Andy Griffith Show. He actually came up with some of the funniest bits, like the lawman's code routine and the preamble to the Constitution. He really was a comedy genius, wasn't he?
He was. He absolutely was. And sometimes he would just be sitting there writing these ideas down, like they might be at a meeting or something. It would just come to him and he'd start writing. And other times they would say, "Hey, we're coming up a minute or two short. Why don't you and Andy go over there and come up with something?" So he was usually the one who came up with the idea, and then he and Andy would work it out. And then they would turn what they had come up with over to Aaron Rubin, who was the show's showrunner, producer, major force behind the Andy Griffith Show. And he would actually script that out. And then it would go in the show.
It's just amazing. You said that the real Don Knotts was a shy, quiet, modest man, nothing like the nervous and unpredictable Barney Fife, but that there were elements of Barney Fife inside your dad. What did you mean by that? Well,
as a child, if you had met him as a child, he was probably Barney Fife then, because he had tormentors. He had people who would tease him relentlessly, like these two fellows that owned the grocery store next door, even his older brothers. The reason they teased him was because he was skinny, funny looking, and they could really get under his skin. And that made them feel better about themselves, that they could really torment this poor kid who was just, and the more upset he got, the funnier he was. So they would just keep at it. So he realized at some point that was a gift and that he was going to exploit that. But it took a long time. It took a while for him to learn how to control them laughing at him instead of being a victim of it.
Yeah, that's one of the most important coping mechanisms of being bullied that I experienced as a kid, was if I could make them laugh, they would stop beating me up.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Now, Barney was such a physically active and emotional character. Do you think it required a lot of energy for your dad to play Barney?
Oh, totally. Very much so. I mean, he was exhausted. That's why, people ask, why did your father leave the show? Well, he was offered a contract. They were only supposed to do 5 seasons. That was in their contract. And that came to an end. And then he was offered a contract to do 5 feature films by Lou Wasserman at Universal. But also by that time, that was such an exhausting character. He was in almost every show. He was always usually the fulcrum of the show, which, all that emotion that he played required an extreme amount of energy. And by the end of 5 seasons, 5 years, really, that's really asking a lot of the writers too, to keep coming up with situations and storylines. That's really hard after that point. And you don't want to go from the level of excellence to going down to good or okay. You want to go out on that high note where people always cherish every episode, which is exactly what has happened.
And people need to remember that in those days, a season was 26 episodes. It wasn't like now with 8 or 10 or 12.
That's right. Oh my gosh. People have it much easier now, than they did then. Yeah, that's right. So they were actually working on 2 shows per week, really, because when they get to Thursday, they would do the read through for the next week's show. And then on the weekend, he had to spend his whole weekend learning lines, which took him the whole weekend because he was fanatic about learning the lines and knowing the lines perfectly, because that's what gave him the ability to really climb inside the character and just give those excellent performances.
And boy, did he ever. I want to ask you about Andy Griffith. He was clearly the glue that held the show together, and he was known for creating a warm and friendly ambiance on the set. Your dad and Andy Griffith were extremely close friends, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they were. They talked on the phone quite a bit. Andy loved my dad probably more than anything or anyone on this earth. He was just I would say if a man could be in love with another man who's straight, he was. And my dad was also very fond of Andy. They were not really alike, so they didn't really hang out. Like Andy liked to hunt and all that. My dad was not a sportsman.
But it was a bromance.
A bromance, yes. That's exactly.
And when Andy Griffith starred in Matlock, your dad appeared in 17 episodes. I wonder what it was like for him to be reunited with Andy in a TV series.
I wonder that too. I never got to ask him about that, but I know they were thrilled. And the show's producer, Dean Hargrove, didn't want my dad on Matlock, and he fought Andy on that. He said it was a serious show. There's no room for this character comedian, the next door neighbor, who was just a wonderful thing. But Andy kept fighting and fighting. In the end, Andy realized that Dean was right. He admitted that later that Dean was right, but he never regretted having my dad on the show. And then once he got him on the show, he had to go and fight for Dad to get a better salary. They wanted to pay him like peanuts, but they got him a decent salary. They just loved each other. And I think those scenes were really precious. Les Calhoun was the character's name.
I was very intrigued. You described Andy Griffith as moody and mercurial. Why?
Well, he, of course, if you've seen A Face in the Crowd, then Andy's seminal movie role, you see another completely different character. Well, I believe that character, along with Andy Taylor, lived inside of Andy Griffith.
Really?
And I felt there were always these two different characters vying for his attention. And he intellectually, he was a good man. He was a very good man, and he protected the actors that were on the show, but he could be kind of rough at times, a little bit. From what I've heard, he never was with me, but I've heard that he could be a little bit, what would I say?
Temperamental?
Yeah, temperamental, I guess you could say. I never saw him that way, but to me, he was always wonderful. So he was a very complex man, but his heart was in the show. His heart was, he really was. When they first started that with Leonard Stern, Andy was the one who said, this needs to reflect these Southern characters that reflect this loving town. That was his concept.
Do you have a favorite episode of the Andy Griffith Show?
I have several, but I really like Barney's First Car.
Oh, that was my favorite too.
Is it? Yeah, Dad's too. And The Choir. I think those are our two favorite ones.
Every year there are festivals in North Carolina called Mayberry Days. What do you think is the reason that the Andy Griffith Show has remained so popular and beloved all these years?
Because they're characters that are so real. And people fall in love with the characters. And to them, those characters are so real that they still exist. And they talk about them like the Mayberry fans. They talk about the characters as if they're still there and still alive and really living. And they'll get on there and they'll start talking in the voice of the characters online or whatever, on Facebook or whatever group they're in. So it's also, they said that even though they made the show in the 1960s, which was a very tumultuous decade, but they made the show as if it was the 1930s. In their mind, it was the same as the time they grew up in. And so it's kind of like this little classic bit of the world that lives on in perpetuity. Nobody else did anything like that. All the other sitcoms, the black and white sitcoms of that time period, were, kind of silly, hokey, but they were very funny. Like the Dick Van Dyke Show was very funny. There are a lot of funny ones, but none of them had that ability to capture an era of time that no longer existed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It idealized a piece of Americana that we all wish we could still live in.
That's right. It's idyllic.
You're roughly the same age as Ron Howard, and
I'm
you
the
got
same age,
to,
exactly.
you're exactly the same age, and you got to meet him on the set of the Andy Griffith Show when you were both kids. What was he like?
He was serious. At least the way I met him, he was. But my brother said, that he was a perfect Opie. He was on the set too, and this photographer came, I guess, PR man said, Ronnie, sit there. And Ronnie sat down. And he took a picture and he said that Ronnie did his perfect Opie look, whatever that means. But he did his perfect Opie look. And then when I met him, I was very shy around him. It took me a while to open up to him. But what finally broke the ice between us was when he smiled and I saw that he had missing teeth and I had missing teeth too. And that brought us together as children instead of just, oh, here's this child actor who's famous working on my dad's show and me visiting. So then we bonded over that.
Now, when you were a kid, you wanted to be an actor, but your father didn't encourage it because he wanted you to have a normal childhood. Was that frustrating for you, Karen, knowing that your dad seemed to have no problem working with a child actor, Ronnie Howard, on the show?
Yeah, I did. I was disappointed, but on the other hand, I had a pretty darn good childhood. So I wasn't like, fuming about it, but I took it up with him on several occasions. And one time I decided to do an audition for him. And I had the scripts of the Andy Griffith Show would arrive to the house every week. And I would be the first one to receive it because I wasn't in school yet at that time. And so I'd take the script and I'd scurry it up to my room and I'd start turning all the pages looking for female characters that I could imitate and learn, improve my acting ability. At the time I was like 6 years old or something, 5 or 6. And then I decided to do an audition for my dad. So I found a little hat and a basket in my mom's closet. And I went up to my parents are sitting at the dining room table with a candlelit dinner. And I launched into my impression of Aunt B. Andy, Barney, there's a big basket of fried chicken and pickles and cornbread. I want you to eat it all up. Don't leave a single crumb. I want everyone to be as plump as me.
That was really good.
Thank you. Dad thought so too. And he said, but the part of Aunt B has already been cast, honey.
Now, you wrote very candidly about the challenges you faced trying to create your own identity when everybody knew you as Don Knotts' daughter or maybe Barney Fife's daughter. I want to quote something to you that you wrote in the book, Karen. You said, when I was growing up, people were obsessed with Dad and talked about him all the time. I felt like I had to represent him. I was more focused on his identity than my own. I couldn't define who I was until I started getting therapy. Karen, that perfectly sums up the dilemma of being the child of a big star, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that all children or relations of famous people struggle with their identity issues because people see you, and at least initially, as an extension of that famous person. It's just natural, to do that, and it's not their fault. So you can't blame them, but you have to, first of all, I felt like, well, I'm Don Knotts' daughter, Barney Fife's daughter. I should be what people will expect. I don't want to disappoint people. That was the feeling. And my father was the same way. He stayed out of politics. He didn't say controversial things. He didn't want to upset people. He wanted to make people happy. And so that kind of extended onto me too.
Well, you wrote very candidly about the emotional breakdown you had when you were 20. You were hospitalized for a number of weeks. You came out of it really beautifully. And I just want to applaud you. I think you're such a pillar of strength. I found that part of your book really very moving and also inspirational and instructive to other people, because even if you're not the child of a famous star, you could be the child of someone who's a local politician or a judge or a very local doctor.
Or even if you have a famous, like a sister who's a beauty queen in high school or a football star in high school, even that can affect you.
Yeah, I really commend you for opening up in the book that way. And I invite people to buy this book and read carefully what Karen says about forging your own identity, because I thought it was very instructive.
Oh, thank you. That was the reason that I decided to talk about that in the book, was because I figured, well, maybe I could help some people who are going through the same thing. And it kind of was a relief to me too, to go in to talk about that, because you don't usually, people usually don't expect you to start talking about something like that, especially when they didn't even know you had that problem to begin with. But I thought, let me help people out here.
Well, I'm glad you did. In 1964, Don Knotts starred in The Incredible Mr. Limpet, which was the first movie to extensively combine live action and animation. I always felt that if Disney had made that movie instead of Universal, it would have been an even bigger hit than it was. Do you agree?
Do you know who said those exact same words that you just said right now? Lou Wasserman, the head of Universal Studios, who signed my dad to a 5-picture contract. He said, if Disney had put that movie out, it would have made millions. It's exactly his words. You're very astute. But
wow.
So he signed him up.
Do you have a favorite Don Knotts movie? Mine was The Ghost and Mr. Chicken.
I liked that one. I also liked, and of course, Mr. Limpet, but also loved The Love God, which is a movie that a lot of people don't know about because the studio buried it, kind of. They didn't give it much fanfare when it came out because they didn't realize when he was making the movie that it was a satire of Hugh Hefner and the Playboy clubs. And they thought with my dad's squeaky clean image that people would be upset. So they kind of hid that movie, and people still don't know that movie exists even.
I wonder if it's available on DVD.
It is.
Okay, so people, all you Don Knotts fan out there, go and rent or buy The Love God, because I have seen it, and it is a satire, and it's Don Knotts like you've never seen him.
That's for sure.
For a while, your dad had a weekly TV variety show. You said he was uncomfortable being a host because he was so shy being himself on TV. He preferred to play a character. So when you watched him being a host, was he being himself?
No, not really. He had sort of a presentational thing he was doing, which was, I would say, it wasn't really himself. I mean, I wish that what they would have done is just have him sit in a chair, and just be relaxed, because he was trying to be like a master of ceremonies. I think that was kind of what he was playing out like. And he really needed to just be himself. He was so lovable. I never was in a room with my father, no matter what day and age, what time, how old, where he wasn't the center of attention in the room, unless it was in a big restaurant or something where people didn't know he was there. But any other time, all eyes were focused on him. And that's all he ever needed to do, was just be him.
That's so true. I know your dad didn't want you to be a child actor, but when you grew up, I assume he finally did support your desire to be an actress, because you got to do a scene with him on his variety show when you were 16. And as an adult, you performed with him in a number of plays. And in 1986, you got to play Rudine, Opie's secretary, in Return to Mayberry, which was such a wonderful reunion show. Can you tell us a little about that experience, Karen?
Oh, yeah, that was wonderful. Yeah, his attitude changed because he could see that I had the talent and I wasn't going to give it up. But that was a wonderful experience playing Rudine, because I got to work with Andy, and I always idolized Andy. He, to me, was just magnificent, and he was wonderful to me. I got to, go on the set, and the set we shot was on location, which was very different from the old days of the Andy Griffith Show. By that time, it was 1986. They were doing outdoor shoots, so we shot that outdoors, and then they had a scene set up where Opie, now grown-up Opie, is now editor of the town newspaper. So I played the secretary. I was very nervous. I wanted to be perfect for Andy, but I was so nervous. I had a hard time getting the words out. So he suggested that I eat a cookie. So he suggested that as a secretary, I eat a cookie and say the lines, "Oh, you're Mr. Taylor's Mr. Taylor." I mean, his father. And so that gave me a character. He was brilliant that way.
He really was. And I got to tell you, you did a great job. It was very touching.
Thank you. It wasn't much, but it was really great to be in it.
In 1979, Don Knotts joined the cast of Three's Company as Mr. Furley. He replaced Norman Fell, who played the landlord, Mr. Roper. You wrote that your dad didn't like the wild applause from the studio audience every time he made an entrance. Why not?
Well, that was an interview with Thief Sutton, who he had told that. Thief was a writer friend of his. He had told that too, but I understand why. It was because Well, it's not that he didn't like it. He loved the applause, he loved the laughter, but it was not realistic to to the scene. He always felt that having a live audience react kind of just took something away from the audience watching at home on TV, because it sort of broke the reality or whatever, and it was more over the top. It's kind of like being in a stage play, really.
Yeah, that's
But
actually a very emotionally mature critique to be making, because when I read that in your book, I thought, he's right. When you watch I Love Lucy, for example, every time the audience laughs, you realize you're watching a show and not something real.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's what he was getting at there. And also, I think he just preferred also to work in a more realistic kind of way.
So he didn't need to hear an audience laughing at him for him to have the confidence to know that what he was doing was funny.
Well, I think in that situation, it helped because, first of all, he wasn't as confident, quite as confident with Mr. Furley. But when he had those outlandish outfits on, those outrageous outfits, and he would get a big laugh when he first made that entrance because of the outfit. And he said that made him relax a little and feel more confident. So yeah, he did like that part of it.
Did your dad have an opinion about Suzanne Summers' departure from the show because they wouldn't give her the raise she wanted?
Yeah, but he always felt that it was Alan Hamill's fault, her husband, manager's fault, that she was really asking for too much money. I mean, more than was realistic. She should have been, he felt, she should have been given a raise, but not as much as he was demanding. And he was really demanding a lot of money. And so, and just also knowing those producers the way they were not going to do that. They just were not those kind of people. And they were terrible about, saying she could never perform her character anywhere else. She couldn't even take it to Las Vegas. They claimed that they owned that character, which is, is kind of the truth. But Barney Fife is also owned by CBS. And that's the way they do things. So she really ended up being stranded. But my dad helped her with the Las Vegas act that she was going to do. And he was fond of her.
It's too bad that Alan Hamill didn't take a page out of the Don Knotts handbook, because he didn't do his wife any favors when she ended up leaving the show.
He really didn't. I agree with you.
Now, your dad made 7 movies with Tim Conway, and they were great friends. And he also filled in for Harvey Korman when they were on tour. Did you get to know Tim Conway very well?
No, because he was a very shy person, and I was a very shy person. And when you get 2 shy people, it's like, I'm not shy, but normally, but he brought the shyness out in me somehow. And I would just get so tongue-tied around him. The only times I really saw him was at Christmas, where he would have these incredible Christmas parties. And then he would be the center of attention because he was so funny at the parties. So I didn't really get a chance to talk to him much. But it wasn't until my father passed and he came to see my one-woman show, Tied Up in Knots, which is the same title as the book, in a little theater called the Lonnie Chapman Theater, GRT now. It's called the GRT. And it was the first time that I'd ever put the show on for a very small audience. And he came and saw the show. And afterwards, he came and gave me a hug.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah. And then I asked him another time, I asked him if he would let me use a story that he had told, and if I could use that in my book. And he said yes. And he was just a sweetheart. I shouldn't have been so shy around him.
No, you shouldn't have. And I think that we had his daughter, Kelly Conway, on our show. And when I told her you were coming on the show, she said to give you a big cyber hug. So I'm giving you one.
Thank you. And kiss back to you, Kelly.
You described your dad as a very private person. He didn't live the flashy Hollywood party lifestyle. How did he handle the fame that came with being a big star?
Well, it was kind of complicated with him because he didn't like being overwhelmed. Like when he was after the Andy Griffith show, whenever he would go on tour, like in a play or something like that, and people would know that he was going to be somewhere, there would always be a car parked sort of hidden somewhere. And then this guy would come up and say, Bob at the office looks just like Barney Fife. And then this guy would come like dressed as Barney Fife. So there were all these Barney Fifes that would always be there. wanting to meet him and stuff. And so that, I think, well, he was a little frustrated with that because, after a while, he moved on from Barney Fife, I mean, he was felt honored and flattered, and he always appreciated how successful that character was. But he was the kind of person who never looked back. He didn't keep things from he did have a couple of things that Andy Griffith had given him, and he had the chair. The chair from the sheriff's office had been bronzed, and Andy had given him that, and he had that, and he had a picture from the show of the three, Andy, Barney, and Gomer, sitting in their director's chairs. He had that, and I think there was one other item that he kept in his condo. But he mentally had moved on. He never watched the old shows. He never did any of that. So constantly running into people that, were always wanting to talk about Barney Fife was a little frustrating because he was doing plays. He was doing Neil Simon plays all across the Midwest. And he was in different roles all the time. But one place that he really liked to be recognized was when he would go out to eat. And he'd always go to the same restaurant, and the waiters all knew him, and they gave him the special service, and, and he was a very shy person. But he loved when he would go in the restaurant and they would know him there. And then if people, and I would always be watching, and I would see the people recognize him sitting around him, and I would watch to see if they would get up the nerve to come over, and sometimes they would be talking, like they would look over and they would be talking, and I'd say, yep, here they come. I'd say that to myself, here they come, they're coming over. And then, and then they'd come and they'd be like so nervous. They'd be like, excuse me, Mr. Knotts. And he'd turn around and give him the warmest smile you can imagine.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah. And then he would talk to them for a little bit.
And another thing that's so unique about Don Knotts is that it's very well known in the industry that he was universally beloved by everyone who ever knew or worked with him. To my knowledge, Karen, there's never been even a hint of ego or bad behavior or unprofessionalism. I think that's really an amazing reputation to have in this business, don't you think?
It certainly is. I mean, to be as loved as he is, even today, I still see his name popping up on shows or references to him, his work, or his facial expressions all the time. And it's like the successful people in our industry just revere him, and so that is remarkable.
Yeah, there's a good reason for it. And you mentioned several times in the book that Don Knotts was a ladies' man. He wasn't classically handsome like Cary Grant, but he was so intelligent and funny and such a gentleman. I can totally see why women loved him, don't you think?
Yeah, but that is part of the enigma. It's like, what really drew them to him? I don't know. And I have pictures of women just kind of falling all over him, and just like co-stars and things, or just got their arms wrapped around him, and he's just looking like, doing his little funny faces or whatever. It's really still an enigma to me exactly what it was. But I know it's like sometimes even I would be affected, like when you'd just be talking to him, he would draw you in a way that nobody else could, even saying nothing, even saying absolutely nothing. He could just draw you in. It's just amazing.
It's called charisma and magnetism, and he had it in spades.
He did. That's true. That's what it is.
Now, in 1999, your dad wrote an autobiography called Barney Fife and Other Characters I Have Known, and Andy Griffith wrote the foreword. What did you think of the book, Karen?
Well, Dad never liked to reveal very much about himself. He's a very, very private person. And I think that the book was written in the style of the times when he grew up, when you had people like Robert Benchley. A lot of people today don't know that name. Robert Benchley was a monologist, and it was very popular in those days to have funny little stories, little anecdotes or whatever, and people would read those and everything. And so his book is really filled with anecdotes, and they're great little stories, but he didn't really get in depth about his life. And so today we would not consider that a memoir. That would not be considered a memoir because it didn't really reveal that enough to him. And my book went a step beyond that.
Yes, that's why I asked you that question, because for people out there who think they know Don Knotts from his book, think again. You need to read Karen's book because she opens the window to who he really was. And another thing about him, he just loved to work. He toured with a one-man show. He did voiceover work. And even after he was practically blind because of macular degeneration, he kept working and had to learn his lines verbally because he could no longer read. That is just so remarkable.
Well, I think he was also, he needed to make money too. He wasn't wealthy. And, he was taking care of some people that, he always took care of people that needed help and stuff like that. And so he was always conscious of that too, but he did love to work. And he was so great at it that, there were always opportunities.
That's for sure. Who wouldn't line up to see Don Knotts in any play?
Right.
Now, we've already mentioned that your dad was a very private person. In this book, as I've said, you were very candid about his life, including his anxieties, his insecurities, and you even wrote about his alcohol problem. Do you think your dad would have approved of the book?
That's hard to say. And that's also another reason why I waited so long to write the book, because I thought, well, he was a very private person and I don't want to be breaking that. But then I thought, I think that he would now, in retrospect, be very happy with the book, because, at the time when he was going through those things, that's different, but afterwards, then you gain perspective. And I didn't write anything that would have embarrassed him. I never.
No, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think that once he was gone, it's about the legacy, the body of work, the talent. And you managed to strike the balance between honoring that body of work and the legacy and the talent, and also giving his fans a real sense of the human being that produced all of that.
Thank you.
That magic.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to hear you say that.
So Karen, tell us about your one-woman show, Tied Up in Knots, that you've been touring with all over the country.
It's different from the book, of course, because it's a 90-minute show and you can't get all that information into a show like that. But it's very funny, and it also is poignant. I play the characters instead of just writing them. I'm actually acting them out. And I do have 2 shows coming up in West Virginia. On March 12th, I'll be in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and on March 13th in Morgantown, West Virginia. The one in Parkersburg is the Smoot Theater, and in West Virginia, it's the Metropolitan Theater. And people can find out about those shows on my website, which is KarenKnotts.com, and also on my Facebook. And so it's a very, very entertaining show.
I do want to mention to our viewers once again, you can follow Karen and find out about her performances and everything that's happening on her website, KarenKnotts.com. Well, Karen, it's been such a pleasure meeting you and getting to celebrate your father's life and incredible career. Thank you for writing your wonderful book and for keeping your father's legacy alive. And thanks for coming on our show.
I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Harvey.
Our guest has been actress and author Karen Knotts. Her book, Tied Up in Knots, My Dad and Me, is available wherever books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.